The ruins of New Geneva stretched endlessly across the scarred landscape, twisted metal and concrete reaching toward a sky choked with smoke. 3 solar cycles had passed since the Zephyrian Empire's final assault, and nothing moved among the wreckage except scavenger drones picking through the debris for salvageable technology. The once proud human colony that had defied galactic convention by establishing itself in contested space was now nothing more than a graveyard. High above the devastation, something stirred in the crimson clouds. A shadow passed over the ruins, too large to be any known aircraft, too graceful to be falling debris. The creature descended slowly, its massive wings cutting through the toxic atmosphere with practiced ease. Scales the color of burnished copper caught what little sunlight penetrated the perpetual haze, each one larger than a human torso. Corvanus had lived for over 3 millennia, and in all that time, he had never seen destruction quite like this. Dragons were not emotional creatures by nature, but something about the systematic annihilation of an entire world struck him as unnecessarily cruel. The Zephyrians were thorough, he would give them that. They had not simply conquered New Geneva. They had erased it. The great dragon landed amid what had once been the colony's central district, his claws scraping against the fused glass that had been a marketplace just days before. His golden eyes surveyed the scene with ancient wisdom, cataloging the methods of destruction. Plasma bombardment from orbit, followed by ground forces to eliminate any survivors. Standard Zephyrian doctrine when dealing with what they termed rebellious lesser species. A sound caught his attention. It was faint, barely audible over the settling debris and distant groaning of unstable structures, but unmistakably organic. Corvanus tilted his massive head, his enhanced hearing isolating the source. Crying. The weak, desperate cry of something very young and very much alive, moving with surprising delicacy for a creature of his size. Corvanus navigated through the rubble toward the sound. It led him to what appeared to be a collapsed residential building, its lower levels crushed beneath tons of concrete and steel. But there, in a gap between 2 fallen support beams, something glinted in the filtered light. The dragon lowered his great head and peered into the cavity. What he found defied all logic and probability. Nestled in what had once been a reinforced storage room, protected by the building's own collapse, was a human infant. The child could not have been more than a few months old, wrapped in a simple blanket that somehow remained clean despite the surrounding devastation. Corvanus studied the scene more carefully. The room showed signs of hasty preparation. Emergency supplies were scattered about, and the walls bore the scorch marks of a portable shield generator that had long since burned out. Someone had hidden here during the attack, had tried to protect this child. They had not survived, but their sacrifice had not been in vain. The infant's cries grew weaker, and Corvanus realized the child was dying. Not from injury, but from hunger and exposure. The emergency supplies had run out, and the shield generator's failure had allowed the toxic atmosphere to seep in slowly. Without intervention, the child would not survive another day. Dragons did not involve themselves in the affairs of lesser species. This was a fundamental truth that had governed Corvanus's existence for 3,000 years. They were observers, witnesses to the rise and fall of civilizations across the galaxy. They did not interfere, they did not choose sides, and they most certainly did not rescue abandoned infants from war zones. Yet as Corvanus looked down at the helpless human child, something stirred within his ancient chest. Perhaps it was the sheer improbability of the infant's survival. Perhaps it was the obvious love and sacrifice that had gone into protecting this small life. Or perhaps it was simply that in 3 millennia of existence, he had never encountered something so fragile that nonetheless refused to surrender to death. The practical part of his mind listed all the reasons this was impossible. Human infants required specialized care, specific nutrition, constant attention. He was a dragon, a creature of flame and scale and ancient magic. He knew nothing of caring for the young of any species, let alone one so different from his own. But the child's cries were growing fainter, and Corvanus found himself reaching into the cavity with one massive claw. His scales could generate heat when needed, and his magic could purify the poisoned air around the infant. It would not be a permanent solution, but it might buy time to find a better one. The moment his scaled talon touched the child's blanket, something unexpected happened. The infant's cries stilled, and tiny fingers reached out to grasp the edge of his claw. The touch was impossibly small, impossibly weak, but it carried a weight that surprised the ancient dragon. trust. Complete, absolute trust from a being that had no reason to trust anything in this ruined world. Corvanus carefully lifted the child from the rubble, cradling the tiny form against his chest where his natural heat could provide warmth. The infant looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too aware for something so young, and made a small sound that might have been contentment. For the first time in 3,000 years, Corvanus made a decision that had nothing to do with ancient wisdom or draconic tradition. This child would not die on his watch. Somehow, against all logic and probability, he would ensure its survival. The great dragon spread his wings and launched himself into the toxic sky, the human infant cradled safely against his chest. Behind them, the ruins of New Geneva continued their slow collapse into history, but ahead lay possibilities that neither dragon nor human could yet imagine. As they climbed higher into the atmosphere, leaving the poisoned world behind, Corvanus began to understand that his long existence had just taken a turn that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the galaxy and his place in it. The child in his arms represented more than just a life saved. It was the beginning of something that would reshape the very foundations of galactic civilization. The other dragons would call him mad. The galactic powers would hunt them both. But as the infant's small hand curled around his scales, Corvanus discovered that for the first time in millennia, he had found something worth protecting at any cost. The journey to the sanctuary took 4 days of careful flight through the outer rim territories, far from the major trade routes where Zephyrian patrols might spot them. Corvanus had chosen a destination that few in the galaxy knew existed. Drakmor, the hidden world where dragons retreated when they needed solitude from the chaos of younger species. It was a place of ancient forests and crystal caves, where time moved differently and the very air hummed with old magic. During the long flight, Corvanus learned things about human infants that 3 millennia of existence had never taught him. They required feeding every few hours, and their tiny bodies lost heat alarmingly quickly. He discovered that his natural warmth could keep the child comfortable, and that a careful application of his magic could transform simple water into something nutritionally suitable for human consumption. It was exhausting work, requiring constant attention and precise control of power that he typically reserved for much grander purposes. The infant, whom Corvanus had begun calling Ember due to her tendency to curl up against the warmest parts of his scales, proved remarkably adaptable. She seemed to instinctively understand that any sudden movements or loud cries might attract unwanted attention during their journey. Instead, she watched the stars pass by with wide, curious eyes that tracked the movement of distant ships and nebulae with an intelligence that surprised her draconic protector. When they finally reached Drakmor, Corvanus faced his first major challenge. The world's mystical barriers, designed to hide the planet from outside detection, were keyed to draconic life signatures. Bringing a human through them should have been impossible, but as they approached the shimmering energy field that concealed the planet, something unexpected occurred. Ember reached out from her position against his chest, her tiny hand pressing against the scales directly over his heart. The moment she made contact, the barriers recognized her as somehow belonging to him, and they passed through without resistance. The implications of this were staggering, but Corvanus filed the observation away for later consideration. His immediate concern was finding a suitable place to care for his unusual charge. The crystal caves of Drakmor's northern continent provided the perfect solution. The caverns were naturally heated by geothermal vents, and the crystalline formations could be carefully shaped to create an environment suitable for human habitation. Corvanus spent days preparing a small chamber, using his fire to smooth rough edges and his magic to ensure proper air circulation. He created a sleeping area lined with the softest materials he could find and established a fresh water source that would remain pure and at the proper temperature. But creating a suitable environment was only the beginning. As the days passed, Corvanus realized that raising a human infant required knowledge he simply did not possess. Dragons hatched from their eggs already possessing basic survival instincts and a portion of ancestral memory. Humans apparently arrived in the world completely helpless and remained so for an alarming length of time. Everything had to be learned through trial and error. The proper way to support Ember's head when moving her, the exact temperature her food needed to be, the meaning behind different types of cries, The fact that human infants required far more sleep than he had anticipated, but only in specific conditions. Some nights she would refuse to settle until he hummed a low rumbling sound that seemed to comfort her. Other times, she needed to be held upright against his chest while he moved in a slow, rhythmic pattern around the cave. The most challenging aspect was not the physical care, but the gradual realization of what he had committed himself to. Ember was growing with each passing day, and her needs were becoming more complex. She began to show interest in her surroundings, reaching for the crystal formations and making small sounds that seemed intended as communication. Her eyes followed him whenever he moved, and she would become distressed if he was out of sight for too long. 3 months after their arrival on Drakmor, Corvanus received an unexpected visitor. Seraphina, an ancient silver dragon who served as something like an elder among their kind, arrived without warning or invitation. She materialized in the main chamber of his cave complex in a swirl of silver light, her presence immediately filling the space with an aura of old power and older disapproval. "Corvanus," she said, her mental voice carrying overtones of concern and confusion. "The council has been watching. They are aware of what you have done." The great copper dragon positioned himself protectively between Seraphina and the chamber where Ember slept. "What I have done is save a life that would otherwise have been lost. Surely even the council cannot find fault with such an action." Seraphina's golden eyes narrowed as she studied him. "You know it is not that simple. You have bound yourself to a creature whose lifespan is but a fraction of yours. Worse, you have brought human technology and human presence to a world that has remained hidden for 10,000 years. The barriers accepted her because they recognize her as part of you now. Do you understand what that means?" Corvanus had suspected, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through his ancient bones. The mystical connection that had allowed Ember to pass through Drakmor's defenses was not temporary. Somehow, in saving her life and caring for her needs, he had created a bond that went beyond simple guardianship. She was, in some fundamental way, part of him now. "The council demands your presence," Seraphina continued. "You will explain your actions and submit to their judgment. The child will be disposed of in whatever manner they deem appropriate." The words hit Corvanus like a physical blow. In the 3 months since finding Ember, he had not allowed himself to think too deeply about the future. He had focused on immediate needs, on keeping her healthy and safe. But now the reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He had made himself responsible for a being that the highest authorities of his own species viewed as a contamination to be eliminated. "No," he said simply, the word carrying a finality that surprised them both. Seraphina stepped back, her expression shifting from disapproval to alarm. "You would defy the council? For a human infant?" "I would protect a life I chose to save," Corvanus replied. "The council can judge me as they see fit, but they will not harm Ember while I live." The silver dragon studied him for a long moment, her ancient mind processing implications that stretched far beyond the immediate situation. "You realize what you are choosing? The council's authority has been absolute for millennia. To defy them is to declare yourself an enemy of all dragonkind." From the inner chamber came a small sound, the soft cry of an infant waking from sleep. Without hesitation, Corvanus turned toward the sound, his massive form moving with the careful grace he had learned over months of practice. Seraphina watched in amazement as the great dragon gently lifted the human child, cradling her against his chest with a tenderness that spoke of countless repetitions of this same action. Ember opened her eyes and looked up at Corvanus, her tiny hand reaching out to touch his scales. The gesture was so trusting, so completely without fear despite the presence of a stranger, that even Seraphina felt something stir in her ancient heart. "She knows you," the silver dragon said softly. "Truly knows you, in a way that few beings ever will." Corvanus nodded, his golden eyes never leaving Ember's face. "And I know her. She is mine to protect, Seraphina. Not property to be claimed, but family to be defended. The council will have to accept that or destroy us both." As if sensing the weight of the moment, Ember made a small cooing sound and smiled up at her protector. It was the first time Corvanus had seen her smile, and the expression transformed her face into something radiant and impossibly precious. Seraphina spread her wings, preparing to depart. I will carry your words to the council, but know this, old friend, you have chosen a path that will change everything. For you, for her, and perhaps for the galaxy itself. After she vanished in another swirl of silver light, Corvanus was left alone with Ember in the crystal cave. The child had fallen back asleep in his arms, completely unaware that her very existence had just set in motion events that would challenge the fundamental order of galactic civilization. The Council's response came swifter than expected. 7 days after Seraphina's departure, the skies above Drakmor darkened with the approach of 5 ancient dragons, each one a master of their respective elements and disciplines. They descended upon the crystal caves like living storms, their combined presence sending tremors through the mountain itself. Corvanus felt them coming long before they arrived. He had been expecting this confrontation since the moment he chose to defy the Council's authority, but that did not make it any easier to face. As the great dragons settled on the crystalline plateau outside his cave, their massive forms casting shadows that seemed to drain the warmth from the air itself, he carefully placed Ember in the safest part of her chamber and sealed the entrance with barriers of his own making. Throgmar the Black emerged as their spokesman, his obsidian scales drinking in light rather than reflecting it. He was older than Corvanus by several centuries, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority when he spoke. Corvanus of the Copper Flame, Throgmar intoned, you stand accused of violating the fundamental laws that have governed our kind since the beginning of recorded time. You have interfered in the affairs of lesser species. You have brought alien presence to our most sacred world. You have bonded yourself to a creature whose very nature threatens the secrecy we have maintained for millennia. How do you answer these charges? Corvanus emerged from his cave with deliberate calm, his copper scales gleaming despite the shadows cast by his accusers. I answer that I saved a life that would otherwise have been lost. I answer that I have harmed no one and threatened nothing except the rigid traditions that you mistake for wisdom. Valthera the Silver, ancient beyond measure and known for her mastery of time magic, stepped forward. Her voice was like winter wind through crystal chimes. You speak of tradition as if it were mere custom, young one. These laws exist because the alternative is chaos. We are beings of immense power in a galaxy filled with species barely evolved beyond their primitive origins. Our interference, however well-intentioned, inevitably leads to imbalance and destruction. And yet, Corvanus replied, my interference has led to the preservation of one innocent life. What destruction do you see in that? Zephyron the Golden, master of solar fire and perhaps the most powerful among them, spoke next. You see only the immediate result. We see the larger pattern. This human child will grow, and as she does, she will carry with her the knowledge of our existence. She will know our strengths, our weaknesses, our secrets. She will become a bridge between our world and theirs, and through that bridge will come all the chaos and corruption that we have spent millennia avoiding. The accusation struck deeper than Corvanus had expected. He had not considered the long-term implications of Ember's knowledge, had not thought about what it would mean for her to grow up knowing dragons as something other than legends. But even as the weight of their words settled upon him, he found his resolve unchanged. Then, teacher, he said simply, if you fear what she might become in ignorance, then ensure she grows in wisdom. The 5 ancient dragons exchanged glances that spoke of mental communication beyond Corvanus's ability to perceive. When they turned their attention back to him, their expressions had shifted from anger to something that might have been pity. You do not understand what you ask, said Mystara the Green, her voice carrying undertones of growing things and deep earth. To teach her properly would require integrating her fully into our society. She would need to understand not just our capabilities, but our history, our purpose, our role in maintaining galactic balance. No outsider has ever been granted such knowledge. Then perhaps it is time for that to change, Corvanus replied. The galaxy is not what it was when these laws were first written. The Zephyrian Empire grows stronger each year, consuming species and worlds with impunity. The old order that we swore to protect is crumbling whether we intervene or not. Perhaps having an ally who understands both dragons and humans could serve the greater good. Throgmar's laugh was like the rumble of distant thunder. An ally? You propose to make this infant creature our equal? To grant her knowledge that we guard even from each other? I propose to raise her with the wisdom to use such knowledge responsibly, Corvanus said. I propose to prepare her for a role that none of us have considered before. The debate continued for hours, with each ancient dragon presenting arguments that had been refined over centuries of similar discussions. They spoke of precedent and tradition, of the careful balance that kept their kind hidden from galactic politics. They reminded Corvanus of the wars that had been fought in ages past when dragons had chosen sides in mortal conflicts, and the devastation that had resulted. But as the day wore on, something began to shift in the tone of their conversation. Perhaps it was the passion in Corvanus's voice when he spoke of protecting Ember. Perhaps it was the gradual realization that their traditional isolation was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the galaxy grew, smaller and more connected. Or perhaps it was simply that some among them had grown weary of watching civilizations rise and fall without ever taking action to guide events toward better outcomes. It was Vylthara who finally broke the deadlock. There is another consideration, she said quietly. The child has already bonded with Corvanus in ways that go beyond mere guardianship. The barriers of this world accepted her because they recognized her as part of him. That bond cannot be severed without destroying them both. Zephyron leaned forward, his golden eyes studying Corvanus with new intensity. Is this true? Have you allowed such a connection to form? Corvanus nodded slowly. I did not choose it deliberately, but yes. She is part of me now, and I am part of her. To harm her would be to harm me. To separate us would be to damage us both irreparably. The admission changed everything. Dragons understood such bonds, rare though they were. In their long history, there had been instances of similar connections forming between dragons and certain rare individuals among the younger species. These bonds were considered sacred, inviolable, and to be protected at all costs. Mystara was the first to speak after this revelation. If such a bond truly exists, then the child is no longer simply human. She is something new, something unprecedented. Perhaps that changes the nature of what we are dealing with here. Throgmar's expression remained stern, but Corvanus could see the conflict in the ancient dragon's eyes. Even if we accept the existence of this bond, the fundamental problems remain. She will grow up knowing our secrets. She will age and die while Corvanus lives on. She will inevitably become a bridge between our kinds, whether we will it or not. Then, let us ensure that bridge is built with wisdom rather than ignorance, said a new voice from the entrance to Corvanus's cave. All 6 dragons turned in surprise as Seraphina emerged from the crystal tunnels, and in her arms, carefully cradled against her silver scales, was Ember. The infant seemed completely at ease with the ancient dragon, showing no fear despite being held by a creature she had never seen before. How did you? Corvanus began. Your barriers recognized me as friend, not foe, Seraphina explained. And she? She looked down at Ember with something approaching wonder. She was not afraid. She looked at me and somehow knew that I meant no harm. That level of intuitive understanding in one so young suggests abilities that go far beyond normal human capacity. Ember chose that moment to reach out toward Corvanus. Making the small sounds that he had learned meant she wanted to return to his care. Without thinking, he extended a claw toward her, and she grasped it with both tiny hands, pulling herself closer with surprising strength. The assembled dragons watched this interaction with growing amazement. There was something in the child's movements, in the way she responded to Corvanus's presence, that spoke of a connection deeper than any they had previously imagined. Perhaps, Vylthara said slowly, we have been asking the wrong questions. Instead of debating whether this bond should exist, we should be considering what it means for the future. If dragons and humans can form such connections, if they can truly understand each other as equals despite the vast differences in their nature, then perhaps the time has come to reconsider our role in galactic affairs. Zephyron nodded thoughtfully. The Zephyrian Empire grows stronger each year. Their expansion threatens not just individual worlds, but the balance of power that has maintained relative peace for centuries. We have watched from the shadows as they consume civilization after civilization. Perhaps it is time to consider more direct action. And if we are to take such action, Mystara added, then having allies who understand both our capabilities and our limitations could prove invaluable. The Council's decision, when it finally came, surprised everyone present, perhaps even themselves. Rather than demanding Ember's removal or Corvanus's exile, they chose a path that none of them had previously considered possible. The child would remain on Drakmor, but she would be raised not just by Corvanus but by the entire dragon community. She would be educated in their ways, taught their history and their wisdom, prepared for a role that had never existed before. She would become the first human to be granted full knowledge of dragon society, and in return she would serve as a bridge between their kinds when the time came for dragons to emerge from the shadows once more. 15 years passed on Drakmor like pages turning in an ancient tome, each one marking another step in an unprecedented experiment. Ember grew from infant to child to young woman, under the guidance of beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Her education was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Mathematics taught by creatures who had helped design the orbital mechanics of solar systems, history lessons from beings who had personally observed the events they described, and combat training from masters whose techniques had been refined over millennia. But it was not just knowledge that the dragons imparted to their unusual student. They taught her the deeper mysteries of their kind, how to sense the flow of cosmic energies, how to read the patterns that governed probability and fate, how to touch the ancient magics that bound the universe together. To their amazement, Ember proved remarkably adept at these teachings, displaying abilities that should have been impossible for any human. By her 15th birthday, Ember had grown into something that defied classification. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the lean strength of someone trained from birth in physical combat. Her hair had darkened to a deep auburn that caught light like burnished copper, and her eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom far beyond her years. Most remarkably, she could communicate with dragons through the same mental channels they used among themselves, the ability that even the Council had thought impossible for a human to develop. Corvanus watched her practice in the crystal arena that morning, sparring against combat constructs that the dragons had created from living stone and elemental fire. She moved with fluid grace, her human agility enhanced by techniques that no member of her species had ever learned before. Her opponent struck with enough force to shatter granite, but Ember flowed around their attacks like water, responding with precision strikes that found the exact points where their magical matrices were most vulnerable. She improves daily, observed Seraphina, who had become something like a second guardian to Ember over the years. Her combat skills now rival those of dragons half their age. Her combat skills concern me less than her dreams, Corvanus replied quietly. She has been having visions again, images of burning worlds and species crying out for help. I think her connection to the cosmic flow is growing stronger. This was the development that none of them had anticipated. As Ember matured, her bond with Corvanus had deepened beyond simple emotional attachment. She had begun to display abilities that seemed to bridge the gap between draconic magic and human intuition. Her dreams often showed her events happening in distant parts of the galaxy, and more than once her visions had proven prophetically accurate. The most disturbing of these visions had begun 3 months ago. Ember had awakened screaming from dreams of a massive fleet bearing down on a peaceful world, its inhabitants trapped and helpless as their skies filled with the terrible ships of the Zephyrian Empire. But in her dreams she had also seen something else, dragons emerging from hiding to stand against the invaders. Their ancient power turned at last toward protecting the innocent rather than simply observing their fate. The Council meets today to discuss her latest vision, Seraphina continued. The world she described, Kepler 438b, is real. Our long-range scouts have confirmed that a Zephyrian battle fleet is indeed moving toward it. The question is whether we act on information gained through unconventional means. Corvanus watched as Ember completed her training session, dismissing the constructs with a gesture that combined draconic power words with purely human innovation. The result was magic that worked differently than anything the dragons had seen before, more direct and immediate, lacking some of the ancient ritual but gaining in spontaneous effectiveness. What does she want to do? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. The same thing she always wants to do, Seraphina replied with what might have been amusement. Save everyone. That evening, the council convened in the great chamber at the heart of Drakmor, their massive forms arranged in a circle around the crystal formation that served as both meeting place and mystical focus. Ember stood at the center, no longer the tiny infant that Corvanus had rescued from the ruins, but a young woman whose very presence seemed to alter the flow of energy in the room. "Tell us again what you have seen," Throgmar commanded, his voice echoing from the obsidian walls. Ember closed her eyes and extended her awareness, touching the cosmic currents that connected all things. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through both air and the deeper frequencies that dragons used for communication. "The Zephyrian fleet will reach Kepler 438b in 18 days, she said. "They bring with them new weapons, devices that can drain the life force from entire continents to power their war machines. The planet's population numbers nearly 8 billion souls, most of them still in the early stages of industrial development. They have no space fleet, no orbital defenses, no way to resist what is coming." "And you believe we should intervene?" Valthera said. It was not a question. "I believe we have the power to save them and therefore the responsibility to try," Ember replied. "For 15 years you have taught me that power without purpose is meaningless. You have shown me that knowledge without action is just another form of ignorance. How can I accept those teachings and then stand by while billions die?" Zephyron leaned forward, his golden scales catching the crystal light. "You speak of responsibility, young one, but do you understand the consequences of what you propose? If we reveal ourselves now, if we enter openly into galactic politics, there will be no returning to the shadows. Every species, every empire, every faction will know that dragons exist and will want either our aid or our destruction. The shadows are already failing," Ember pointed out. "Your own scouts report that Zephyrian intelligence has detected energy signatures consistent with draconic magic on 3 different worlds this past year. How long do you think it will be before they piece together the truth? How long before they develop weapons specifically designed to hunt dragons?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. It was something the Council had been avoiding for decades, the gradual erosion of their secrecy as the galaxy grew more connected and sensor technology became more sophisticated. The age of hidden watchers was ending whether they chose it or not. Mystara spoke next, her voice carrying the deep patience of growing things. "Even if we accept that our emergence is inevitable, why this world? Why this moment? Kepler 438b has no strategic importance, no resources that would justify the risk of full exposure. Because," Ember said simply, "they cannot save themselves. And because if we wait for the perfect moment, the perfect cause, the perfect justification, we will wait forever while countless innocents die." The debate that followed lasted through the night and into the next day. Ancient dragons who had not spoken to each other in centuries found themselves arguing points of philosophy and strategy that had no precedent in their long history. Some argued for continued isolation, maintaining that the price of intervention was too high. Others suggested limited action, covert assistance that might help without revealing their true nature. But as the hours passed, a consensus began to emerge around a third option, one that none of them had considered before Ember's arrival in their lives. If they were going to emerge from hiding, if they were going to enter the galactic stage as active participants rather than hidden observers, then they needed more than just their own ancient power. They needed allies who understood the younger species, who could serve as interpreters and diplomats and bridges between the old ways and the new. They needed someone like Ember, but not just one. They needed a new generation of beings who combined draconic wisdom with the adaptability and innovation of younger species. They needed to create something that had never existed before, a fusion of ancient power and modern understanding. The decision, when it finally came, was unanimous. They would intervene at Kepler 438b, but not as dragons acting alone. They would go as dragons guided by one who understood both their nature and the nature of those they sought to protect. Ember would not just witness their emergence into galactic politics. She would lead it. "You understand what this means?" Corvanus asked her, as the council dispersed to begin preparations for what would be the most significant action dragons had taken in over 1,000 years. Ember smiled, and in that expression, he saw both the child he had rescued from the ruins and the woman she had become under his care. "It means that for the first time in my life, I get to find out what I was really meant to become." Outside the crystal chamber, the dragons of Drakmor began to stir with a purpose they had not felt in centuries. The time of watching from the shadows was ending. The age of fire and judgment was about to begin. The Zephyrian battle fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 438 system, like a metallic plague spreading across the stars. Admiral Vexthari stood on the bridge of the flagship Dominion's Edge, his chitinous features twisted into what passed for satisfaction among his species. Before him stretched a formation of 300 vessels, each one bristling with weapons designed to reduce entire worlds to radioactive dust. Long-range sensors confirm planetary population at 8.2 billion, reported his tactical officer. No orbital defenses detected. No significant military presence. Standard pacification protocols should be sufficient. The Admiral's mandibles clicked in approval. Kepler 438b would be their 13th conquest this year. Another step in the Empire's inevitable expansion across the galaxy. The planet's inhabitants had barely achieved spaceflight, making them perfect candidates for what the Empire euphemistically called cultural integration. Those useful as slaves would be preserved. The rest would be eliminated to make room for proper Zephyrian colonization. Begin the approach, Vexthari commanded. Deploy the life-drain satellites in standard formation. I want this world rendered compliant within 6 hours. But as the fleet moved deeper into the system, something unexpected appeared on their sensors. A single ship, if it could be called that, had materialized between the Zephyrian fleet and their target world. It was unlike anything in their databases, a vessel that seemed to be grown rather than built, its organic curves pulsing with internal light that defied classification by their most sophisticated instruments. Unknown vessel, you are interfering with Imperial operations, the Admiral broadcast on all frequencies. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed. The response came not through their communications array, but directly into the minds of every Zephyrian on every ship simultaneously. It was a voice that carried the weight of mountains and the heat of stellar cores, speaking in perfect Zephyrian despite its obviously alien origin. I am Corvanus of the Copper Flame, speaker for the Dragon Council. You will withdraw your forces from this system immediately. This world and its people are now under our protection. The bridge of the Dominion's Edge fell silent as the crew processed this impossible communication. Dragons were legend, myths told by primitive species to explain natural phenomena they could not understand. They were not real entities that could challenge the might of the Zephyrian Empire. Admiral Vexthari's response was swift and decisive. All ships target the unknown vessel. Maximum firepower. Destroy this imposter immediately. 300 ships opened fire simultaneously, their combined energy output sufficient to vaporize a small moon. Plasma beams, antimatter torpedoes, and exotic particle weapons converged on the organic vessel, in a display of destructive force that lit up space like a newborn star. When the energy dissipated, the ship remained exactly where it had been, completely unharmed. Worse, it was no longer alone. Other vessels were materializing around it, each one as alien and impossible as the first. But these new arrivals were different in a way that made veteran warriors step back from their weapons consoles in instinctive fear. They were not ships in any conventional sense. They were dragons. Corvanus had shed the concealment that made his true form appear as a vessel, revealing himself in all his ancient glory. His copper scales caught and reflected the light of the system's star, each one the size of a building. His wings, spread wide in a gesture of challenge, could have encompassed entire city districts. He was not alone. 5 other dragons flanked him, their combined presence turning the cold void of space into something that pulsed with life and power. But it was the figure visible between Corvanus's claws that truly shattered the Zephyrians' understanding of the situation. A human woman, somehow surviving in the vacuum of space as if it were no more threatening than a gentle breeze, stood upright and unprotected. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the same impossible quality as the dragon's, reaching into the minds of every being in the fleet. I am Ember, daughter of dragons, voice of the protected worlds. Your empire has spread far enough. Your ships of conquest will advance no further. Choose now, withdraw in peace or face judgment. Admiral Vexthari felt something he had not experienced in his 30 years of military service. Genuine fear. But he was a creature of the Empire, bred for conquest and dominance. The idea of retreat in the face of any enemy, even one as impossible as this, was unthinkable. Deploy the quantum disruptors, he commanded, his voice cracking slightly. Target the largest creature. If these are the dragons of legend, then let us be the ones to prove that legends can die. The quantum disruptors were the Empire's most feared weapons, devices that could unravel the atomic bonds that held matter together. They had been used to destroy entire fleets that refused to surrender, reducing ships and crews to their component particles in seconds. Nothing in the known universe could survive a direct hit from such weapons. The disruptor beams lanced out toward Corvinus, reality itself seeming to bend around their passage. But as they reached the great dragon, something extraordinary happened. The beams struck what appeared to be empty space and simply vanished, absorbed by barriers that existed in dimensions the Zephyrians could not even perceive. Ember raised her hand, and the space around the dragon formation shimmered with power that made the quantum disruptors look like primitive projectiles. When she spoke again, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through the hull of every ship in the fleet. "You have chosen judgment." What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a demonstration of power that reduced the most advanced military force in known space to helplessness in a matter of minutes. The dragons moved through the Zephyrian formation like living forces of nature, their breath weapons turning antimatter torpedoes into harmless light, their claws shearing through hull plating that could withstand stellar radiation. But it was Ember who proved most devastating of all, moving through space as if it were her natural element. She reached out with abilities that combined draconic magic with human innovation in ways that defied all understanding. Zephyrian ships found their weapons turning against each other, their navigation systems redirecting them away from their target world, their life support systems modified to keep crews alive while rendering them completely unable to continue their attack. Within an hour, the mighty Zephyrian battle fleet had been reduced to a collection of drifting hulks, their crews alive but completely helpless. Not a single shot had been fired at the planet they had come to conquer. Not a single Zephyrian warrior had been killed, though their pride and their certainty in their empire's invincibility had been shattered beyond repair. Admiral Vexithari found himself standing alone on his bridge, his crew unconscious around him, facing a human woman who had somehow materialized inside his heavily shielded command center. She stood before him with her arms crossed, her auburn hair moving in a non-existent breeze, her eyes holding depths that spoke of power beyond his comprehension. "Your empire ends here," she said simply. "Not in conquest, not in glory, but in the understanding that there are forces in this universe that will no longer allow you to spread your destruction unchallenged." The Admiral tried to speak, to offer defiance or negotiation or surrender, but found that his voice would not obey him. Instead, he could only listen as this impossible human continued. "Your surviving ships will return to Zephyrian space. You will carry word of what happened here to your Emperor and your High Command. You will tell them that the Dragon Protectorate has been established, and that any species, any world that calls for our protection, will receive it. The age of unopposed conquest is over." She gestured, and Admiral Vexithari felt his consciousness fading. When he awoke, he would find his fleet already en route back to Imperial space, their navigation systems locked onto a course that would carry them home with news that would shake the very foundations of galactic civilization. But Ember was no longer thinking about the defeated Zephyrians. Her attention had turned to the world they had come to protect, where 8 billion souls had just witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. The dragons had emerged from hiding not as conquerors or destroyers, but as protectors. The ancient guardians had finally chosen to guard. Standing in the void between the stars, surrounded by beings of legend and myth, Ember smiled as she felt the cosmic flow shifting around them. The future was unfolding exactly as her visions had shown her, but with possibilities that even her enhanced perception had not fully grasped. The war for the soul of the galaxy was about to begin, and for the first time in millennia, the forces of protection and preservation had champions powerful enough to stand against the darkness. News of the Zephyrian defeat at Kepler 438b spread through the galaxy like wildfire, carried by refugee ships, merchant vessels, and the Empire's own traumatized survivors. Within weeks, every major civilization had heard the impossible tale. Dragons were real, they possessed power beyond imagination, and they had chosen to actively oppose the Empire's expansion. The galactic balance of power, stable for centuries, had been shattered in a single engagement. On the imperial capital world of Zephyros Prime, Emperor Klaxon the Merciless convened an emergency session of the War Council. The massive chamber filled with his most trusted generals and advisors, their chitinous forms clicking with agitation as they debated responses to this unprecedented threat. The holographic display at the center of the room showed tactical data from the Kepler engagement, but the readings were so far outside normal parameters that most dismissed them as sensor malfunctions. Impossible, General Thexmora declared, her mandibles clacking in frustration. No single organism can generate energy output readings this high. No biological entity can survive in hard vacuum without protective equipment. The data must be corrupted. But Admiral Vexithari, recently returned from his humiliating defeat, spoke from personal experience. I assure you, General, the data is accurate. I witnessed capabilities that challenge everything we understand about physics and biology. These dragons, and the human who speaks for them, represent a threat unlike anything our empire has ever faced. Emperor Klaxon's compound eyes fixed on the defeated admiral with the cold intensity that had earned him his title. You speak of threat, Admiral, but I see opportunity. If such power exists, then it can be studied, understood, and ultimately controlled. Prepare our research fleets. I want specimens. The order set in motion the largest military mobilization in Zephyrian history. Research vessels equipped with exotic capture technology, battle fleets armed with experimental weapons, and intelligence gatherers tasked with locating the dragon's home base. The Empire had built its dominance on the principle that anything could be conquered if sufficient force was applied. They were about to test that principle against opponents who had been refining their power for millennia. Meanwhile, the Dragon Protectorate was experiencing growing pains of their own. Word of their protection had reached dozens of threatened worlds, and desperate pleas for assistance arrived daily at the hidden sanctuary of Drakmor. The Council found themselves faced with requests for aid that stretched across half the galaxy, far more than their small numbers could possibly address. Ember stood before the assembled dragons in the great crystal chamber, her voice carrying the weight of impossible choices. 17 worlds have requested protection in the past week alone. 3 are currently under direct attack, 5 more face imminent invasion, and the remainder report Zephyrian scouting forces probing their defenses. We cannot be everywhere at once. Throgmar's obsidian form shifted restlessly as he considered the strategic implications. We have revealed ourselves too soon. The Empire now knows we exist and will adapt their tactics accordingly. Meanwhile, every species in the galaxy expects us to serve as their personal guardians. This is precisely why we maintained secrecy for so long. The alternative was to watch civilizations burn one by one, until only the Empire remained, Ember replied. At least now, some worlds have hope. It was Velthera who proposed the solution that would define the Protectorate's future strategy. We need allies, not just those who seek our protection, but those willing to fight alongside us. The dragons number in the hundreds at most. The galaxy contains billions of sentient beings who oppose Zephyrian expansion. We must forge them into a force capable of defending themselves. The decision to actively recruit and train other species marked a fundamental shift in dragon philosophy. For the first time in recorded history, they would share their knowledge and techniques with outsiders, creating a network of protectors who could extend their reach across the galaxy. Ember became the primary architect of this new alliance. Her unique understanding of both draconic power and non-dragon psychology made her the ideal teacher for species who had never imagined they could wield forces beyond their natural capabilities. She traveled from world to world, establishing training centers where volunteers learned to harness energies they had previously thought mythical. The Altarian crystal singers discovered that their harmonic abilities could be enhanced to disrupt Zephyrian technology across entire star systems. The metamorphic Shafari learned to channel their natural adaptability into forms of magical resistance that made them nearly impossible to detect or capture. Most remarkably, the humans from various colony worlds proved exceptionally adept at combining dragon techniques with their own innovative approaches, creating hybrid methods that surprised even their teachers. But it was on the world of Proxima Centauri B that Ember encountered something that would change the trajectory of the war itself. The planet's defenders, a mixed population of humans and AI entities working in symbiosis, had developed technology that could interface directly with draconic magic. They presented her with a prototype that defied everything she thought she understood about the limitations of such integration. We call it the Resonance Engine, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the project's lead scientist. It's designed to amplify and focus magical energies through technological means. In theory, it could allow a single dragon to project their power across multiple star systems simultaneously. The device looked deceptively simple, a crystalline matrix surrounded by exotic matter generators and quantum field manipulators. But when Ember tested it under controlled conditions, the results exceeded all projections. Her consciousness could extend across vast distances, her abilities manifesting simultaneously on a dozen different worlds. For the first time since the Protectorate's formation, they had a tool that might actually let them protect every world that requested their aid. The news of this breakthrough reached the Zephyrian Empire through their extensive spy networks, and Emperor Klaxon's response was swift and merciless. If the dragons could multiply their power through technology, then that technology had to be destroyed before it could be replicated. The assault on Proxima Centauri B came without warning. A massive Imperial fleet, led by the experimental dreadnought Annihilator Prime, dropped out of hyperspace and immediately began bombardment of the planet's surface. But this time, the Zephyrians had come prepared for draconic intervention. Their ships carried new weapons based on captured energy signatures from the Kepler engagement, resonance disruptors designed to interfere with magical manipulation, quantum scramblers that could destabilize the dimensional barriers dragons used for protection, and most dangerously, neural dampeners that could sever the mental connections dragons relied upon for their most powerful abilities. When Corvanus and 5 other dragons arrived to defend the world, they found themselves facing an enemy that had learned from previous encounters. The Zephyrian fleet surrounded them with overlapping fields that made their traditional techniques far less effective. Worse, the enemy seemed to know exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage to both dragons and their human allies. The battle that followed was unlike anything either side had experienced before. Dragons found their ancient powers constrained and countered at every turn, while Zephyrian forces faced defenders who adapted their tactics in real time, finding new ways to combine magic and technology, even as their enemies tried to suppress both. It was Ember who turned the tide. Standing on the surface of Proxima Centauri B next to the prototype resonance engine, she made a choice that no one had thought possible. Instead of using the device to amplify her existing abilities, she used it to share them. Every defender on the planet, every volunteer who had trained under her guidance, suddenly found themselves connected to the same cosmic flow that dragons had mastered millennia ago. The effect was immediate and devastating to the attacking fleet. Zephyrian ships found themselves facing not just 6 dragons, but thousands of beings who could wield draconic power with human creativity and innovation. Their resonance disruptors were overwhelmed by the sheer number of magical sources. Their quantum scramblers failed against techniques that had never existed before. Their neural dampeners proved useless against a collective consciousness that spanned an entire world. In the space of an hour, the most advanced assault fleet in Zephyrian history was either destroyed or fleeing back to Imperial space. But the cost of victory had been high. The resonance engine had burned out from the strain of connecting so many minds, and several of the dragons had been severely injured by the Empire's new weapons. As Ember knelt beside Corvanus, who had taken the worst of the enemy fire to protect the device, she realized that the war had entered a new phase. The Empire would continue to adapt, to develop new weapons and tactics designed specifically to counter draconic abilities. But they had also proven that dragons and younger species could work together in ways that multiplied the strengths of both. "We need more than just allies," she whispered to her wounded guardian. "We need to become something neither dragons nor any other species has ever been before. We need to evolve." Looking up at the stars where the defeated Zephyrian fleet was retreating, Ember began to plan for a transformation that would reshape not just the Protectorate, but the very nature of what it meant to be a guardian of the galaxy. The age of dragons standing alone was ending. The age of united defense was about to begin. 5 years after the Battle of Proxima Centauri B, the galaxy had transformed into something unrecognizable from the age of Zephyrian dominance. The Dragon Protectorate had evolved into the Galactic Defense Alliance, a confederation of over 300 worlds united not by conquest, but by mutual protection and shared knowledge. At its heart stood beings who defied classification, individuals who combined the ancient wisdom of dragons with the innovation of younger species, creating abilities that transcended the limitations of either. Ember stood on the observation deck of Harmony Station, the Alliance's mobile headquarters that orbited no single world, but moved throughout the galaxy wherever it was needed most. At 25, she had become something unprecedented in galactic history, the first being to serve as both dragon and human, bridging two forms of existence that had never before been unified in a single consciousness. The transformation had begun during Corvanus's recovery from his injuries at Proxima Centauri b. As she had tended to his wounds, sharing her life force to accelerate his healing, something fundamental had changed in both of them. The bond that had connected them since her infancy deepened beyond emotional attachment or magical connection, becoming a true fusion of consciousness that allowed each to share the full experience of the other's existence. Through this merger, Ember gained access to draconic memories spanning millennia, while Corvanus experienced the world through human perception for the first time in his ancient life. The result was a being who possessed the patience and wisdom of dragons combined with the adaptability and creativity that defined humanity at its best. The Zephyrian Emperor has agreed to the meeting, reported Captain Zara Okafor, the Alliance's chief diplomat and a former refugee from one of the Empire's earliest conquests. He will come to the neutral zone at Kepler 442, but he's bringing a fleet of 500 ships. Ember nodded, her enhanced perception already aware of the massive Imperial formation moving toward the designated meeting point. He brings them not as a show of force, but as proof of his desperation. The Empire is collapsing from within as species after species declares independence and joins our alliance. He knows that continued warfare will only accelerate his Empire's destruction. The truth of this assessment was evident throughout the galaxy. The Zephyrian Empire, once seemingly invincible, had lost nearly 40% of its territory over the past 5 years, not through conquest by the Alliance, but through liberation movements sparked by the knowledge that effective resistance was possible. The Empire's strength had always been based on the belief that they were unstoppable. Once that belief was shattered, their control began to crumble. But Emperor Klaxon the Merciless was not coming to surrender. Intelligence reports suggested he was bringing with him a weapon that his scientists claimed could destroy dragons permanently. Something called the Reality Anchor, that could supposedly trap beings of magical nature in physical forms, vulnerable to conventional attack. "Are you certain about meeting him face to face?" asked Dr. Chen, now the Alliance's chief technology officer and the architect of the improved resonance network that connected all Alliance worlds. "Our projections suggest a 73% probability that this is a trap designed to eliminate Alliance leadership." Ember smiled, the expression carrying both human warmth and draconic confidence. "I'm certain that this war cannot end through force alone. The Empire needs to see that there is a future beyond conquest, a path that leads to something better than endless expansion and domination. Sometimes the greatest risk is also the only hope for lasting peace." The meeting took place in the void between stars, on a neutral platform constructed from crystalline materials that neither side could manipulate with their respective technologies. Emperor Klaxon arrived in his personal dreadnought, a massive vessel that dwarfed even the largest Alliance ships. But when he disembarked onto the platform, he came alone. His chitinous form somehow diminished when separated from the trappings of Imperial power. Ember met him at the center of the platform, her form flickering between human and something far more majestic as her dual nature asserted itself. Behind her, just visible at the edge of perception, stood the ghostly forms of every dragon who had ever lived, their collective wisdom accessible through her transformed consciousness. "So," the Emperor said, his voice carrying the weariness of a ruler who had seen his empire crumble, despite possessing the most powerful military force in the galaxy. "You are the human who thinks herself a dragon, or perhaps the dragon who chooses to be human. Which is it?" "I am both and neither," Ember replied. "I am what becomes possible when ancient wisdom embraces new possibilities, when protection becomes more important than power. I am what you could become if you chose to transform rather than destroy." Klaxon's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter or derision. "You speak of transformation to one whose empire spans 1,000 worlds. What could you possibly offer that would surpass such achievement?" "Purpose," Ember said simply. "Your empire controls territory, but it creates nothing lasting. Your conquests add worlds to your domain, but they do not add meaning to your existence. What will remain of all your achievements when the last Zephyrian dies? What legacy will speak of your species' time among the stars? The Emperor gestured toward his fleet, their weapons trained on the platform despite the supposed neutrality of the meeting. Power is its own legacy. Strength endures when all else fades. Does it? Ember asked, and suddenly the space around them filled with images drawn from her enhanced memory. Civilizations that had once seemed eternal, empires that had claimed to be everlasting, conquerors who had believed their strength made them immortal, all of them reduced to archaeological curiosities, remembered only as cautionary tales or footnotes in the histories of those who had outlived them. These beings all believed as you do, she continued. They all thought that the ability to destroy was the same as the power to create. They were wrong. Only those who choose to protect and nurture leave marks on the universe that time cannot erase. Emperor Klaxon studied the images surrounding them, his compound eyes reflecting scenes of civilizations rising and falling across galactic history. For a moment, something shifted in his expression, a crack in the certainty that had driven his species' expansion for centuries. Even if I believed you, he said finally, my people would never accept such a path. We are bred for conquest, shaped by evolution and culture to dominate or be dominated. You ask us to become something we are not. I ask you to become something you could be, Ember corrected. The Alliance has room for warriors, for those who understand the necessity of strength in defense of the innocent. Your people's skills need not be wasted. They need only be redirected toward worthy purposes. What followed was not negotiation in any traditional sense, but a sharing of visions that transcended language and logic. Through her enhanced abilities, Ember showed the Emperor glimpses of what the galaxy could become, a confederation of species working together, each contributing their unique strengths to common goals. She showed him Zephyrian warriors serving as protectors rather than conquerors, their military skills turned toward defending trade routes and eliminating pirates and slavers. She showed him Zephyrian scientists working alongside Alliance researchers, their aggressive pursuit of knowledge channeled into healing rather than weapon development. Most importantly, she showed him the legacy such a transformation could create. A Zephyrian species remembered not as tyrants and destroyers, but as the guardians who helped forge a golden age of galactic cooperation. The Emperor was silent for a long time after the visions faded, his ancient mind processing possibilities he had never before considered. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that would reshape the galaxy. If I were to consider such a path, he said carefully, what guarantees could you offer? How could I know that your alliance would accept those who have been their enemies for so long? The same guarantee I offer everyone who joins us, Ember replied. The chance to prove that the past does not have to define the future. The opportunity to be judged by actions taken in service of protection rather than conquest. The formal end of the Zephyrian War came not with surrender documents or territorial concessions, but with a simple handshake between an evolved human-dragon hybrid and an ancient emperor willing to transform his empire into something greater than itself. The weapon Emperor Klaxon had brought to destroy dragons remained unused. Its reality anchor technology eventually repurposed to create stable platforms for diplomatic meetings between species whose natural environments were incompatible. 6 months later, the first Joint Alliance Zephyrian patrol began operations in the Outer Rim, hunting down the slavers and pirates who preyed on vulnerable worlds. A year after that, former Zephyrian warships were delivering aid to famine-stricken planets, their cargo holds filled with food and medical supplies rather than conquest forces. Standing once again on the observation deck of Harmony Station, now accompanied by both Corvanes in his full draconic glory and Emperor Klaxon in the ceremonial armor of an Alliance protector, Ember watched as the latest group of volunteers completed their training. The class included Zephyrians, humans, Altarians, Shafari, and a dozen other species, all learning to combine their natural abilities with techniques that had once been the exclusive province of dragons. Do you ever regret it? Corvanes asked, his mental voice carrying currents of deep affection and ancient wisdom. The transformation, the responsibilities, the weight of guiding an entire galaxy towards something it has never been before. Ember considered the question seriously, as she considered all questions that touched on the fundamental choices that had brought them to this moment. She thought of the infant she had been, rescued from ruins by a dragon who had chosen compassion over tradition. She thought of the child she had become, raised by beings of legend who had taught her that power without purpose was meaningless. She thought of the woman she was now, carrying the hopes and dreams of countless worlds toward a future that none of them could achieve alone. "I regret nothing," she said finally. "Every choice brought us closer to this moment, to this possibility. We have created something unprecedented in galactic history. A civilization based on protection rather than conquest, on cooperation rather than domination. If the price of such achievement is the transformation of everything I once was, then it is a price worth paying." Outside the observation deck, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, but the galaxy they illuminated was no longer the same. War still existed, but it was war against oppression rather than for conquest. Strength still mattered, but it was strength used to defend the weak rather than to dominate them. And at the center of it all, bridging the gap between legend and reality, between ancient wisdom and new possibilities, stood a being who had once been a helpless infant in the ruins of a destroyed world. The dragons had finally found their true purpose, not as hidden observers but as active guardians. And the galaxy, for the first time in recorded history, had found hope for a future where cooperation triumphed over conquest, where protection mattered more than power, and where even the smallest life saved from destruction could grow to transform the destiny of countless worlds. The age of fire and judgment had given way to the age of wisdom and protection. And it had all begun with a dragon who chose to save one small human life among the ruins of war.